At this point in this brief question and answer introduction to the World Transformation Movement, Professor Prosen has asked me to say something about how I managed to find these understandings of the human condition when the whole issue has been such an unbearable subject to look at. It's true that the issue of the human condition has been all but unapproachable. To illustrate this, the online encyclopedia Wikipedia says that philosophers and psychologists regard the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard's 1849 book The Sickness Unto Death as one of the best accounts ever given on the subject of the nature of despair. As the title of the book, The Sickness Unto Death, indicates, the despair that the philosophers and psychologists are referring to that Kierkegaard gave such a deadly accurate description of is the suicidally sickening, worse than death, depression that the tormenting good and evil contradiction of the human condition has caused humans whenever they allowed their minds to even momentarily glimpse it. So I'll read, this is part of that deadly accurate description that Kierkegaard gave of that worse than death depression that the issue of the human condition has caused. The torment of despair is precisely the inability to die. That despair is the sickness unto death, this tormenting contradiction, that's contradiction of the human condition. This sickness in the self, eternally to die and yet not to die. There is not a single human being who doesn't despair at least a little, in whose innermost being there doesn't dwell an uneasiness, an unquiet, a discordance, an anxiety in the face of an unknown something, or something he doesn't even dare strike up an acquaintance with. He goes about with the sickness, goes about weighed down with the sickness of the spirit, which only now and then reveals its presence within, in glimpses, and with what is for him an inexplicable anxiety. Yes, we humans have learned to live in such complete denial of the unbearable issue of the human condition that whenever the anxiety from it momentarily appears, we are so unaware of where that anxiety is coming from that it does seem inexplicable to us. The great Russian philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev also wrote extraordinarily honestly about the pure terror that the issue of the human condition has caused humans. In his 1931 book, The Destiny of Man, Berdyaev referred to the ancient primeval terror of the fallen state of the world, of the deadly pain of the very distinction of good and evil, of the valuable and the worthless. He described that distinction between good and evil as the bitterest thing in the world. So yes, the issue of the human condition has seemed to be universally unapproachable, but not entirely unapproachable, because in The Destiny of Man, in the passage where the quote I just read came from, Berdyaev also gave this very clear description of a way, in fact the only way, understanding of the human condition could be found. Referring to, and possibly even inspired by the courage of Kierkegaard's writing about the human condition, Berdyaev wrote that knowledge requires great daring. It means victory over ancient primeval terror. Fear makes the search for truth and the knowledge of it impossible. Knowledge implies fearlessness. This doesn't imply that the experience of fear is not lived through. On the contrary, it may be deeply felt, as it was for Kierkegaard. It must also be said of knowledge that it is bitter, and there is no escaping that bitterness. Particularly bitter is moral knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil, which is the issue of the human condition. But the bitterness is due to the fallen state of the world and in no way undermines the value of knowledge. It must be said that the very distinction between good and evil is a bitter distinction, the bitterest thing in the world. Moral knowledge is the most bitter and requires the most fearlessness of all, for in it sin and evil are revealed to us, along with the meaning and value of life. There is a deadly pain in the very distinction of good and evil, of the valuable and the worthless. We cannot rest in the thought that that distinction is ultimate. We cannot bear to be faced forever with the distinction between good and evil. Ethics must be both theoretical and practical, i.e. it must call for the moral reformation of life and the revaluation of values. And this implies that ethics is bound to contain a prophetic element. It must be a revelation of clear conscience, unclouded by social conventions. It must be a critique of pure conscience. As Berdyaev said, we cannot be faced forever with the distinction between good and evil. We cannot rest in the thought that that distinction is ultimate. As a species, we couldn't endure having to live forever with the crippling depression of the human condition and with the deadening effect of alienation from having to live in denial of the human condition to cope. Understanding of the human condition certainly had to be found, and to go over what Burdyev said, finding it was going to require fearlessness of the subject of the human condition. He said that the distinction between good and evil, which is the study of the issue of the human condition, is the bitterest thing in the world, the hardest subject to confront. So much so he said that only fearlessness of it could conquer it. Then explaining from where this fearlessness would come from, he said that the study of moral knowledge, of ethics, of the issue of good and evil in the human makeup that leads to the moral reformation of life and the revaluation of values, in other words, that leads to the transformation of the human race from a self-preoccupied, selfish existence to a selfless one, would require a revelation based on a clear conscience unclouded by social conventions, namely the social conventions of denial of the issue of the human condition. He said it would require a prophetic element, a critique of pure conscience. So solving the human condition required a clear conscience, a conscience unclouded by the social conventions of denial of the whole depressing subject of the issue of the human condition. Only those who weren't made to feel, as Burdyev said, worthless when thinking about the human condition, that is, only those who haven't been exposed to upset in their infancy and childhood, and who are thus relatively free or innocent of upset, only those with a pure conscience could hope to fearlessly face and investigate the issue of the human condition. For everyone else, will suffer fearful depression if they try to confront and think about the issue of the human condition. In fact, everyone else will be resigned to living in denial of the issue of the human condition. Obviously, only those innocent enough of upset to not have become resigned to avoiding the whole subject of the human condition could hope to solve the human condition. I mean, if you can't think about it, you can't solve it. Now, as the story of Adam Stork describes, when humans became conscious some 2 million years ago, their search for knowledge unavoidably involved becoming upset, that is, angry, egocentric and alienated. The upset state of the human condition emerged. Clearly, by the end of that heroic 2 million year search for knowledge, there was going to be a great deal of knowledge and a great deal of upset. Science, the formalisation of the pursuit of knowledge, developed, and it discovered nerves and genes and how they differ in the way they process information, how one is insightful while the other isn't. So science found the clues that made explanation of the human condition possible. But you see, science was being practiced by humans who were resigned to living in denial of the issue of the human condition. So they couldn't put the clues together and explain the human condition. To do that required a human condition confronting rather than human condition avoiding denial-free approach, a critique of pure conscience, as Burdyev said. Basically, a mind free of the upset state of the human condition. So science had to wait for someone who had been exceptionally sheltered from all the overwhelming upset in the world and who could thus fearlessly assemble all the clues and deliver the explanation of the human condition. And that is what happened. That is how I found understanding of the human condition. I grew up in the quiet, natural, soulful countryside of Australia, which is, or was, one of the most sheltered, upset-free, innocent countries left in the world. And only such an innocent place could hope to deliver insight into the human condition. Interestingly, in an interview with Australian television presenter Andrew Denton, Bono, the prophetic lead singer of the rock band U2, said, "You do get the feeling in Australia that there's something going on down here, a new society being dreamt up, that in Australia there's the opportunity to lead the world, to actually just take some moral high ground." To which Denton joked, "You say this to every country you visit." Bono responded, "The only other country I think has the chance and leadership in terms of creating a new model as Australia would be Canada." Now, Australia has been exceptionally sheltered, and only such shelteredness could produce the innocence that Gurdjieff recognised would be needed to unravel the human condition and enable the moral reformation, as he described it, which is the transformation of the world, to happen. Now, as well as the benefit of having grown up in Australia, I had to be and was exceptionally securely loved, nurtured, and sheltered in my upbringing, and also was fortunate enough to be educated in two of the most wholesome schools in Australia. I also grew up in the euphoric flower power age of Aquarius, 1960s, post-war flush of innocence, freedom and idealism that always follows such a terrible exorcism of upset as occurred in the Second World War. I'm not at all special, not in the slightest, just someone who had the good fortune to largely escape encounter with the immensely heroic but also immensely upsetting state of the human condition during my upbringing. And as a result, I found I could think about a subject that was an anathema for most people, and indeed for virtually all people. Importantly, the real hero and liberator of humanity is science. And backing up science has been the efforts of all the humans who have ever lived. Humanity as a whole, but in particular science, did all the hard work of finding the clues that, as I explained, have made the explanation of the human condition possible. It's like in a game of gridiron football where the team as a whole, with one exception, does all the hard work gaining yardage down the field, and finally, when the side gets within kicking distance of the goalpost, the specialist kicker, who until then has played no part, is brought onto the field. Now, while he, in his unsoiled attire, kicks the winning goal, the win clearly belongs to the team of exhausted players who did all the hard work. You see, now that we can understand the great battle that the human race has been waging, we can understand that the least heroic and thus least special are those who haven't been in the battle, which puts me somewhere near the end of the queue in terms of deserving any accolade or special regard from anyone. That is the truth. A fact, in terms of who is deserving, I come last. If I had a second life, or even had the chance of a second career to the one I now have of bringing understanding to the human condition, I would immediately take the most difficult serving job I could find. Maybe taking care of autistic children, or helping those with AIDS, or helping any one of the oppressed or persecuted races, or helping all the starving millions. Do you know that it won't be long before the number of people suffering is outstripped by all those who want to help? And this help won't be sort of driven by the pseudo-idealistic, selfish, so-called love we've been seeing, where people help others in order to make themselves feel better about themselves, as I described earlier. But true love that comes from a desire for the world to be as it really can be. I should say that the notion of who has had to endure the most upset in humanity's great battle, in other words, who has been the most heroic, the most special, is a redundant concept now anyway, because it's replaced by the equality of everyone's goodness and specialness. In the spectrum of alienation that necessarily exists on Earth, there have always been a few people who exist at the innocent, least embattled, sort of least heroic end, which is where I came from and had to come from to be able to look into the human condition, which is the point Gurdjieff is making. But as the story of Adam Stork at last makes clear, while all humans are variously upset, all humans are equally good, because upset was a result of an unavoidable and necessary battle. So some people are taller or shorter than others, but they're all equally good in exactly the same way. some people have been more or less involved in humanity's heroic battle than others, and are thus more or less embattled, more or less upset. But they are all equally good. The equality of goodness and worthiness of all people is the first principle established, fundamental and universal truth now. That fearful worse than death depression that was caused by the good and evil, the valuable and the worthless distinction that Kierkegaard and Berdyaev talked about, no longer exists. It has been eliminated forever. And not by blocking out, denying the whole subject, stopping our brain thinking, or by using terrible lies, such as saying that there's no such thing as truth, because that was nothing more than a construct of language, as postmodernism has tried to assert. You can't eliminate or deconstruct the dilemma of good and evil using lies. That could only be achieved, and now is achieved, by rational, understandable, testable, verifiable, first principle-based biological explanation of the human condition. Knowledge has eliminated the terrifying, sickening distinction between good and evil forever. That distinction can no longer depress us because it no longer exists. With enough digestion time of the understanding that's now available, and that'll take a number of generations, we humans can think freely about any subject without fear of depression. Berdyaev said, we cannot bear to be faced forever with the distinction between good and evil, and we no longer are. Remember that we humans are now able to understand that every one of us is not just good, but the absolute hero of the story of life on earth. So the unbearable terror of the issue of whether we are good or worthy or not has gone from earth forever. We are free now. It's all over. We are free. Humanity no longer has to rely on dogmatic assertions that, all men are created equal, because it's a self-evident truth, as the United States Declaration of Independence asserts. We can now explain, understand and know that our equality is a fundamental truth. And best of all, this dignifying and reconciling, redeeming, healing understanding now allows you and every other human in the world to leave your upset state behind us, dealt with, and immediately be transformed to an effectively human condition-free state. So we can now understand and thus know that everyone is equally good, and also everyone is now immediately, effectively free of the upset state of the human condition. That is an absolutely fabulous, sublimely wonderful situation that the whole human race has dreamt of achieving. And through all the efforts of all the humans who have ever lived, it has now finally, at last, been achieved. We humans have won our freedom. The transformation of the human race is on. We're out of here, leaving the old, exhausted, variously embattled, good and evil, differentiated, upset, messed up world behind forever. What is Bono saying? When love, truth, which is truth, comes to town, I'm going to jump that train. Yes, Beethoven's song. Joy, joyful as a hero to victory. Join in our jubilation. We enter drunk with fire into your sanctuary. Your magic reunites. All men become brothers. All good, all bad. Be embraced millions. This kiss for the whole world.